The stone walls of Raven's Hollow Castle trembled as Sandra Garcia pressed her back against the cold granite, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the corridor, growing closer with each heartbeat. In her arms, she clutched the ledger that contained the truth about the winter deaths, the evidence that would either save her life or seal her fate forever. 3 months pregnant and utterly alone, she had taken the position as castle scribe when no other woman would dare, knowing full well the whispered warnings about the previous scribes who had simply vanished during the harsh winter months. The footsteps stopped just outside the chamber door. Sandra closed her eyes, remembering how she had arrived at this moment, how desperation had driven her to accept employment in a place where women disappeared like morning mist. Her husband Thomas had died in the autumn harvest, crushed beneath a fallen tree, leaving her with nothing but debts and the growing life within her womb. When Lord Christopher James had offered her the position as castle record-keeper, she had ignored the fearful looks from the village women, ignored their urgent whispers about the fate of her predecessors. Now, as she waited in the shadows with trembling hands, she understood why no woman had ever survived a winter at Raven's Hollow Castle. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The truth she had uncovered was far more sinister than simple misfortune or harsh weather. The ledger in her arms contained records of deliberate poisoning, of women's silence before they could reveal the corruption that festered within these ancient walls. The door creaked open, and Sandra held her breath as a figure stepped into the moonlit chamber. She recognized the silhouette immediately, though she had hoped never to face this confrontation alone. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that everything she thought she knew about Raven's Hollow Castle had been a carefully constructed lie. 3 months earlier, Sandra had walked through the castle gates for the first time, her few possessions bundled in a worn cloth sack. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter, and the massive stone fortress loomed above her like a sleeping giant. She was 6 weeks pregnant then, though she had not yet shared this news with anyone. The loss of her husband Thomas still felt like an open wound, raw and bleeding with each breath she took. Lord Christopher James had received her in the Great Hall, a man of perhaps 40 years with steel-gray eyes and prematurely silver hair. He was not unkind, but there was something in his manner that made Sandra feel as though she were being evaluated, measured against some unseen standard. The position he offered was straightforward enough, maintaining the castle's records, correspondence, and accounts. The pay was generous, far more than she could earn in the village, and it included lodging in the castle's east wing. What Lord Christopher had not mentioned, and what Sandra discovered only through hushed conversations with the kitchen staff, was the fate of her predecessors. Helen Myers had held the position the previous winter and had vanished during a February blizzard. Lisa Mitchell before her had simply stopped appearing for meals one January morning, her chambers found empty save for a few scattered belongings. Sandra Cooper had lasted only until December before disappearing entirely, and Sandra Harris had made it through November before meeting the same mysterious fate. The castle's steward, Jacob Edwards, was a thin man with nervous eyes who seemed perpetually startled by sudden movements or unexpected questions. When Sandra asked him about the previous scribes, he would only mutter about the harshness of winter and the dangers of traveling the mountain roads during storms. His evasive answers and fidgeting hands told her more than his words ever could. The work itself proved challenging, but not impossible. Sandra spent her days in a small chamber off the main hall, copying letters, recording expenses, and maintaining the detailed logs that kept the castle functioning. Her handwriting was neat and precise, a skill she had learned from the village priest who had taught her to read and write when she was young. The chamber was cold despite a small brazier, and she often worked with woolen mittens that left her fingertips free. As October gave way to November, Sandra began to notice patterns in the records that troubled her. Supplies would be ordered in quantities that seemed excessive, then recorded as damaged or spoiled in unusually high numbers. Payments were made to merchants whose names appeared nowhere else in the castle's correspondence. Most disturbing were the medical expenses. Regular payments to an apothecary in the distant town of Millbrook for herbs and compounds that were never listed in the castle's medical supplies. The castle's physician, Jose Taylor, was an elderly man who moved through the halls like a shadow. Sandra rarely saw him during the day, but sometimes late at night she would glimpse him carrying small vials and pouches, moving with purpose through corridors that should have been empty. When she encountered him by chance near the kitchens one evening, he studied her with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance, her health, her condition. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it bitter winds and heavy snows that transformed Ravens Hollow Castle into an isolated fortress. The mountain roads became impassable, cutting off all communication with the outside world. Sandra found herself trapped within the stone walls with perhaps 30 other souls, servants and guards who had committed to remaining through the harsh season. It was during those first weeks of winter that Sandra began to feel unwell. At first, she attributed it to her pregnancy, the natural sickness that many women experienced. But as days passed, she realized that her symptoms came and went in patterns that seemed tied to her meals. She would feel perfectly well in the morning, only to become violently ill after the midday meal, then recover by evening. Her suspicions crystallized one December morning when she discovered a small vial hidden behind books in her chamber. The glass container held a clear liquid that had no scent, but when she held it up to the light, she could see a faint residue that suggested it had been used recently. That same day, she began to pay careful attention to who had access to her food, who moved through the corridors near her chambers, who watched her with particular interest. The answer came to her gradually, pieced together from overheard conversations and careful observation. Jose Taylor was not simply the castle physician, but Christopher James's partner in a scheme that had been operating for years. They would hire women as scribes, isolated and vulnerable women who would not be missed if they disappeared. During the winter months, when the castle was cut off from the outside world, they would slowly poison these women while stealing from the castle's accounts. The previous scribes had not simply vanished or fled, Sandra realized with growing horror. They had been murdered, their bodies likely disposed of in the deep ravines that surrounded the castle. The excessive supply orders, the mysterious payments, the medical expenses, all of it was part of an elaborate system of theft that used the deaths of innocent women as cover. Sandra's pregnancy had likely saved her life thus far. She understood now. The poison that Jose Taylor had been adding to her food was not strong enough to kill quickly, designed instead to cause a gradual decline that would appear natural. But her condition as an expectant mother had made her more sensitive to the substance, causing her to become ill quickly enough to recognize the pattern. Armed with this terrible knowledge, Sandra began to document everything she discovered. Working late into the night by candlelight, she created a detailed record of the financial irregularities, the suspicious deaths, the evidence of systematic murder, and theft. She hid her work carefully, knowing that discovery would mean immediate death. The ledger grew thicker as Sandra uncovered more evidence. She found records of payments to gravediggers in distant villages, bribes to officials who would not ask questions about missing women, purchases of lime and other substances used to dispose of bodies. Christopher James and Jose Taylor had been operating their scheme for at least 5 years, possibly longer. The number of women who had died for their greed was staggering. As January deepened into February, Sandra knew that time was running short. The poison doses were increasing, and her body was beginning to show the effects despite her resistance. She needed to find a way to escape the castle and bring her evidence to authorities who could act on it. But the winter storms showed no sign of abating, and the castle remained as isolated as ever. Her salvation came from an unexpected source. Zachary Ortiz was a knight who had arrived at Ravens Hollow in late autumn, seeking shelter for the winter months. Unlike the castle's permanent residents, he was not part of Christopher James's inner circle, and Sandra had noticed that he watched the other inhabitants with the keen eye of someone who sensed something amiss. Zachary was a man of perhaps 30 years, tall and lean, with dark hair and observant brown eyes. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to danger, and Sandra had observed that both Christopher James and Jose Taylor seemed uncomfortable in his presence. When she began to pay attention to his movements, she realized that he was conducting his own investigation into the castle's affairs. Their first real conversation took place in the castle's chapel, a small stone chamber where Sandra had gone to pray for guidance. Zachary found her there one evening, kneeling before the simple altar with tears streaming down her face. He did not speak at first, simply knelt beside her in silent companionship. When she finally looked at him, She saw understanding in his eyes, a recognition of shared purpose. "You know," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the sacred space. "I suspect," he replied quietly, "but suspicion is not proof." Sandra made a decision that would change everything. "I have proof," she told him, and saw his eyes widen with surprise and hope. Over the following days, Sandra and Zachary met in secret, sharing information and planning their next moves. He confirmed her suspicions about the fate of the previous scribes, revealing that he had come to Ravens Hollow specifically to investigate reports of missing women. His sister had been a scribe at another castle owned by Christopher James, and she too had vanished during a winter stay. Zachary's investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that extended beyond Ravens Hollow Castle. Christopher James owned several properties where he employed the same scheme, hiring vulnerable women and murdering them while stealing from his own accounts. The profits were substantial, and the victims were chosen specifically because they would not be missed or thoroughly investigated. Together, Sandra and Zachary developed a plan to expose the truth and escape the castle alive. They would need to time their move carefully, waiting for a break in the weather that would allow them to reach the nearest town with their evidence. In the meantime, Sandra would continue to document everything she could discover, while Zachary would prepare for the dangerous journey ahead. The plan required Sandra to maintain her normal routine while secretly preparing for escape. She continued to take her meals, despite knowing they were poisoned, using techniques Zachary had taught her to minimize the absorption of the toxins. She forced herself to appear increasingly ill, allowing Christopher James and Jose Taylor to believe their scheme was proceeding as planned. As February progressed, Sandra's condition became genuinely precarious. The accumulated effects of months of poisoning were taking their toll, and she knew that she could not maintain the pretense much longer. Her pregnancy was now obvious, adding another layer of complexity to their situation. Zachary had promised to protect both her and her unborn child, but Sandra understood the enormous risks they faced. The break in the weather came suddenly in early March, a temporary warming that melted enough snow to make travel possible. Sandra and Zachary had perhaps 2 days before the next storm system would arrive, trapping them once again within the castle walls. They would have only one chance to escape with their lives and their evidence. On the night of their planned escape, Sandra gathered her documentation and prepared to leave the chamber that had been both her workplace and her prison. She had hidden the most crucial evidence in multiple locations, ensuring that even if she were captured, some proof of the crimes would survive. The ledger she carried contained enough evidence to hang both Christopher James and Jose Taylor if she could reach authorities who would act on it. As she prepared to meet Zachary at their predetermined location, Sandra heard footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber. Her blood turned to ice as she realized that their plan had been discovered. Someone was coming for her, and she was trapped with nowhere to run. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and Sandra pressed herself against the wall, clutching the ledger to her chest. She could hear whispered voices, multiple people discussing something in urgent tones. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain they would hear it through the thick wooden door. The handle turned slowly, and Sandra held her breath as the door creaked open. A figure stepped into the moonlit chamber, and she recognized Jose Taylor's thin silhouette immediately. Behind him, she could see the bulk of Christopher James, and her hope died as she realized that both men knew exactly where she was hiding. "Come out, Sandra," Christopher James called softly. "We know you're here. We know what you have been doing." Sandra remained motionless, praying that the shadows would conceal her, but Jose Taylor moved directly toward her hiding place, as though he had watched her take position. His thin hand reached out and grasped her arm, pulling her roughly into the center of the chamber, where the moonlight illuminated her terrified face. "Such a clever girl," Christopher James said, his voice carrying a tone of mock admiration. "Too clever for your own good, I'm afraid, just like the others." The ledger felt heavy in Sandra's arms, the weight of all the evidence she had gathered, all the proof of their crimes. She knew that her life depended on keeping it safe, on somehow getting it to someone who could act on the information it contained. "Where is your knight?" Jose Taylor asked, his grip tightening on her arm. "Did you think we wouldn't notice your secret meetings? Did you believe we were blind to your little conspiracy?" Sandra's heart sank as she realized that Zachary might already be captured or dead. Their plan had been discovered, and she was alone with the two men who had murdered so many women before her. The baby moved within her womb, a reminder of the innocent life that depended on her survival. "The ledger," Christopher James said, extending his hand. "Give it to me now, and perhaps your death will be quick." Sandra clutched the book tighter, backing toward the window, despite knowing there was no escape in that direction. The drop to the courtyard below was too far to survive, and even if she could somehow make the leap, she would likely kill her unborn child in the process. "You killed them all," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear and rage. "Helen Myers, Lisa Mitchell, Sandra Cooper, Sandra Harris. You murdered them for money." "We provided them with employment," Christopher James replied calmly. "They simply proved unsuitable for the position." "As have you." Jose Taylor produced a small vial from his robes, the same clear liquid that Sandra had found hidden in her chamber. "This will be much faster than the gradual approach we've been using," he said with clinical detachment. "One swallow, and you'll join your predecessors." Sandra looked desperately around the chamber, searching for any means of escape or defense. Her eyes fell on the heavy brass candlestick that sat on her writing desk, and she began to edge toward it, hoping the men would not notice her movement. "Don't make this more difficult than necessary," Christopher James warned, following her movement with his eyes. "You cannot escape, and resistance will only make your final moments more unpleasant." Sandra's fingers closed around the candlestick, just as Jose Taylor lunged forward to grab her. She swung the heavy brass with all her strength, catching him across the temple and sending him staggering backward with blood streaming down his face. The vial flew from his hand and shattered against the stone wall, its contents spreading in a dark stain across the floor. Christopher James roared with anger and rushed toward her, but Sandra was already moving, clutching the ledger in one hand and the candlestick in the other. She dodged past him and ran for the door, her heart pounding with the desperate energy of a mother fighting for her child's life. The corridor beyond was dark and empty, but Sandra could hear Christopher James shouting behind her, calling for guards and servants to block her escape. She ran toward the stairs that led to the Great Hall, hoping to reach the main entrance before they could cut off her path. As she reached the top of the stone steps, a figure emerged from the shadows below. Sandra's heart leaped with relief as she recognized Zachary Ortiz, very much alive and armed with his sword. His face was grim but determined, and she saw that he carried a leather satchel that likely contained his own evidence of the conspiracy. "This way," he called urgently, gesturing toward a side passage that Sandra had never explored. "I know another route out of the castle." Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Christopher James had roused half the castle, and Sandra could hear multiple sets of footsteps echoing through the corridors. Some of the servants were loyal to their lord, while others might be unwitting participants in the crimes. Either way, Sandra and Zachary were vastly outnumbered. They ran through a maze of narrow passages that Zachary seemed to know well, ducking through doorways and around corners as their pursuers spread out through the castle. Sandra's pregnancy made the flight more difficult, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "The stables," Zachary explained as they ran. "I've prepared horses for our escape. If we can reach them before they seal the gates, we have a chance." The passages grew narrower and more winding, clearly designed as escape routes for the castle's defenders during sieges. Sandra clutched the ledger tightly, knowing that it contained the only proof of the crimes that had been committed within these walls. Without it, Christopher James and Jose Taylor would continue their murderous scheme at other castles, claiming more innocent lives. They emerged into the castle's courtyard through a small door hidden behind ivy and overgrown shrubs. The stables were visible across the open space, perhaps 50 yards away, but Sandra could see guards moving between the buildings. Their escape route was not clear, and discovery would mean certain death. Zachary studied the courtyard carefully, counting the guards and noting their positions. "When I give the signal, run directly to the stables," he whispered. "Don't look back. Don't hesitate. I'll create a distraction to draw them away." Sandra nodded, understanding that this might be their only chance. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, protecting the life growing within as she prepared to risk everything on one desperate dash across the courtyard. "Now," Zachary hissed, and Sandra ran. She sprinted across the cobblestones as fast as her condition would allow. The ledger clutched against her chest like a shield. Behind her, she heard Zachary shout something that drew the attention of the guards, followed by the ring of steel as he engaged them in combat. The stable doors loomed ahead, and Sandra could see two horses already saddled and ready for flight. Zachary had planned everything carefully, preparing for this moment while she had been gathering evidence. She reached the horses just as shouts erupted from across the courtyard. Mounting the horse was difficult with the ledger in her arms and her pregnancy affecting her balance. But desperation gave her strength. She managed to pull herself into the saddle just as Zachary appeared at a run, blood on his sword and determination in his eyes. "They're right behind us," he called, vaulting onto his own horse with practiced ease. "Hold tight and don't let go of that ledger no matter what happens." They rode hard through the castle gates and into the night, their horses' hooves ringing against the stone bridge that spanned the deep ravine surrounding Raven's Hollow Castle. Sandra looked back once to see torches moving in the courtyard, but the pursuit seemed confused and disorganized. Christopher James had not expected them to escape, and his guards were unprepared for a nighttime chase through treacherous mountain terrain. The ride to the nearest town was harrowing, following narrow paths that wound through forests and along cliff edges. Sandra's horse was sure-footed, but she had to trust entirely in the animal's instincts as they navigated terrain that would be dangerous even in daylight. Zachary rode beside her, constantly watching for signs of pursuit while guiding them towards safety. As dawn broke over the mountains, they reached the town of Millbrook, the same settlement where Jose Taylor had purchased his poisons. The irony was not lost on Sandra as they rode through streets that were just beginning to stir with early morning activity. The evidence of the apothecary's complicity was contained within her ledger, another thread in the web of corruption they had uncovered. Zachary led them directly to the town's magistrate, a stern man named Justin Reed who listened with growing horror as Sandra presented her evidence. The ledger contained detailed records of financial irregularities, suspicious deaths, and the systematic murder of innocent women. Combined with Zachary's testimony about his own investigation, it painted a clear picture of Christopher James's crimes. Within hours, a company of armed men was riding toward Ravens Hollow Castle, carrying warrants for the arrest of Christopher James and Jose Taylor. Sandra and Zachary remained in Millbrook under the magistrate's protection, knowing that their lives would remain in danger until the conspirators were captured. The siege of Ravens Hollow Castle lasted 3 days. Christopher James had barricaded himself within the fortress, hoping that his stone walls would protect him from justice. But the evidence Sandra had gathered was overwhelming, and neighboring lords who had lost women to similar schemes joined the effort to bring him to account. When the castle finally fell, the full extent of the conspiracy became clear. Hidden chambers contained the belongings of dozens of murdered women, trophies kept by men who had killed for profit and pleasure. Financial records revealed a network of corruption that stretched across multiple counties, involving not just Christopher James and Jose Taylor, but merchants, officials, and other nobles who had profited from the scheme. Jose Taylor was found dead in his chambers, apparently having taken his own poison rather than face capture. Christopher James was taken alive, though he maintained his innocence even when confronted with irrefutable evidence of his crimes. The trial that followed became a sensation, drawing attention from across the kingdom as the full scope of the murders was revealed. Sandra testified at the trial, her pregnancy now showing clearly as she stood before the court and described the systematic poisoning she had endured. Her ledger was entered as evidence, its careful documentation providing the foundation for the prosecution's case. Zachary also testified, revealing how his own sister had been among the victims and describing his investigation into the conspiracy. The trial lasted 2 weeks, with witness after witness describing suspicious deaths, financial irregularities, and the pattern of women disappearing from Christopher James's properties. The defense could offer no credible explanation for the evidence, and the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Christopher James was sentenced to death, his property seized and sold to provide compensation for the families of his victims. The network of corruption was systematically dismantled, with dozens of accomplices facing their own trials and punishments. The apothecary in Millbrook, who had supplied the poisons, was among those arrested, his shop closed, and his license revoked. For Sandra, the trial marked the end of a nightmare that had begun with her desperate need for employment. Her pregnancy progressed normally once she was no longer being poisoned, and she gave birth to a healthy daughter in late summer. The compensation she received from the sale of Christopher James's properties ensured that she would never again face the poverty that had driven her to Ravens Hollow Castle. Zachary remained in Millbrook during Sandra's recovery, officially serving as a witness for ongoing investigations, but clearly reluctant to leave her side. Their shared ordeal had created a bond that went beyond mere friendship, built on trust forged in the crucible of mortal danger. As autumn arrived once again, Sandra found herself standing in the garden behind the small house she had purchased with her compensation money. Her daughter slept peacefully in her arms, safe and healthy despite everything they had endured together. The mountains where Ravens Hollow Castle stood were visible in the distance, but the fortress itself had been abandoned, its reputation too dark for anyone to claim. Zachary found her there as the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He had been offered a position with the King's Guard, recognition for his role in exposing the conspiracy, but he seemed in no hurry to leave Millbrook. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, standing beside her as they watched the sunset, "about what comes next." Sandra looked at him, seeing in his eyes the same quiet strength that had sustained her through the darkest moments at Ravens Hollow Castle. "And what have you decided?" "That some journeys are better taken together," he replied, his hand gently touching the baby's tiny fingers. "If you'll have me." Sandra smiled, feeling a peace she had not known since before her first husband's death. The terror and desperation that had driven her to accept employment at a cursed castle seemed like memories from another life, replaced by the quiet contentment of safety and companionship. "I think," she said softly, "that would suit us very well." The baby stirred in her arms, opening dark eyes that seemed to take in the world with curious intelligence. This child would grow up knowing security and love, never facing the desperate choices that had nearly cost Sandra her life. The ledger that had saved them both now rested in the magistrate's archives, its pages serving as a permanent record of justice served and lives avenged. In the months that followed, Sandra and Zachary were married in a simple ceremony, attended by the townspeople who had welcomed them as heroes. Their story had spread throughout the region, becoming a tale of courage and justice that parents told their children. The woman who had survived Ravens Hollow Castle became a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, truth and determination could triumph over evil. Sandra never returned to the mountains where the castle stood empty and shunned. She had no need to see the place where so many innocent women had died, where she herself had come so close to joining them. The memories she carried were enough, reminders of how precious life and freedom truly were. Instead, she focused on the future, on raising her daughter and building a life with Zachary that was founded on honesty and mutual respect. They opened a small school in Millbrook, teaching reading and writing to children whose parents could not afford formal education. Sandra's experience with record-keeping proved valuable in other ways as well, as she helped local merchants and craftsmen organize their accounts and correspondence. The network of corruption that had claimed so many lives was thoroughly destroyed, its participants dead, imprisoned, or fled to distant lands. New laws were passed requiring better oversight of isolated properties like Ravens Hollow Castle, ensuring that vulnerable women would have protections and recourse if they found themselves in dangerous situations. Sandra's daughter grew strong and healthy, showing early signs of the intelligence and determination that had saved her mother's life. She would learn to read and write, to think critically, and question authority when necessary. Most importantly, she would grow up knowing that women could be strong, that they could fight for justice and win against overwhelming odds. On quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and the family gathered around their hearth, Sandra would sometimes tell her daughter stories about courage and perseverance. Not the dark tale of Ravens Hollow Castle, which could wait until the child was older, but gentler stories about people who faced difficulties and overcame them through determination and hope. Zachary proved to be a devoted husband and father, his protective instincts balanced by respect for Sandra's independence and strength. He understood that she had saved herself as much as he had saved her, that their partnership was built on equality rather than rescue. Their marriage became a model for other couples in the community, showing that relationships could be based on mutual support rather than dominance. Years passed, and the memory of the winter at Ravens Hollow Castle gradually faded from public attention, though it was never forgotten entirely. Sandra kept a single copy of her ledger, locked away in a strongbox, as a reminder of how close she had come to death and how important it was to fight for justice even when the odds seemed impossible. Sometimes on winter nights when the wind howled through the mountains, Sandra would think about the women who had not survived, the scribes who had died alone and afraid in the cold stone chambers of the castle. She had lived to tell their story, to ensure that their deaths were not forgotten and their killers brought to justice. In a way, she carried their memory forward, a living testament to their courage in accepting positions that they knew were dangerous. The daughter she had carried through that terrible winter grew into a remarkable young woman, inheriting her mother's intelligence and her stepfather's quiet strength. She learned the full story of her birth when she came of age, understanding finally why her parents sometimes looked at her with such profound gratitude and protectiveness. Rather than being frightened by the tale, the young woman was inspired by it, seeing in her mother's courage a model for her own life. She chose to study law, determined to help other women who found themselves in vulnerable positions, to ensure that justice remained accessible to those who needed it most. Sandra watched her daughter's growth with pride and wonder, knowing that something beautiful and strong had emerged from the darkness of that terrible winter. The child who had been conceived in love and carried through poisoning and terror had become a force for good in the world, living proof that hope could triumph over despair. As Sandra entered middle age, she remained active in her community, serving on councils and committees that worked to improve conditions for women and children. Her experience at Ravens Hollow Castle had taught her the importance of vigilance, of paying attention to patterns, and asking difficult questions when something seemed wrong. The school she and Zachary had founded grew and prospered, educating hundreds of children over the years and sending many of them on to higher learning and successful careers. Sandra took particular pleasure in teaching young women to read and write, knowing that education was one of the best defenses against exploitation and abuse. Zachary's hair turned gray as the years passed, but his devotion to his family never wavered. He served as a magistrate himself in later years, bringing to the position the same careful attention to detail and commitment to justice that had helped expose the conspiracy at Ravens Hollow Castle. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Sandra and Zachary returned to the mountains where they had first met, though not to the castle itself. They climbed to a high meadow that offered views of the entire valley, including the distant ruins of Ravens Hollow, which had been partially dismantled to prevent anyone from attempting to restore it. "Do you ever regret it?" Zachary asked as they sat together in the afternoon sun, watching their daughter play with her own children in the grass nearby. Sandra considered the question carefully, thinking about all the paths her life might have taken. "I regret the women who died," she said finally. "I regret that it took so long for someone to stop Christopher James. But I don't regret the choices that led me to you, to our family, to this life we've built together." She looked down at the valley below where the town of Millbrook spread along the river like a patchwork quilt. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in gardens, and life continued in all its messy, beautiful complexity. The darkness that had once threatened to consume her seemed very far away, conquered by years of love and purpose. "The women who died at Ravens Hollow Castle were not forgotten," Sandra continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory and resolve. "Their story became part of something larger, a warning and a promise that such things would not be allowed to continue unchallenged." Zachary nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of her words. They had not simply survived a terrible ordeal, they had transformed it into something meaningful, using their experience to build a better world for others. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the meadow, Sandra felt a profound sense of completion. The frightened, desperate woman who had accepted employment at a cursed castle had grown into someone she barely recognized, someone strong and confident and surrounded by love. Her daughter's laughter echoed across the meadow as she chased her children through the wildflowers, and Sandra smiled at the sound. This was what she had fought for during those dark winter months, this continuation of life and hope and joy. The ledger that had saved their lives had been more than just evidence of crimes. It had been a declaration that truth mattered, that justice was worth fighting for, that women's lives had value beyond what others might assign to them. The pregnant widow who had taken a job no woman had survived had not only lived to tell the tale, she had ensured that no other woman would face the same fate. In the end, that transformation from victim to victor, from desperate survivor to protector of others, was perhaps the greatest victory of all. As darkness fell over the mountains and the family made their way home by lantern light, Sandra carried with her the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a story that had begun in terror but ended in triumph, a legacy that would continue long after she was gone.